Week 9 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, and you know exactly what we need to do. We need to break down every single quarterback, every single tight end for every single matchup of Week 9 of 2024 fantasy football, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 9 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 9's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em for the week, as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code THECATCH on Underdog. That link is down below. And very quickly, let me remind you guys as well that we have 2 bye weeks here in Week 9 of the season. The San Francisco 49ers as well as the Pittsburgh Steelers will have their bye weeks here in Week 9, so that means no Brock Purdy, no George Kittle, no Russell Wilson, and no Pat Freiermuth as we approach the week. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, so let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We have the Texans traveling to face the Jets, and let's start with the Texans side of things. So CJ Stroud is kind of in between like the streaming and start category for me, and close maybe even to the sit category. I hate Thursday night matchups. It's not a good matchup against the Jets this week, still giving up the 5th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. And Stroud has not been good the last 2 weeks. Week 8 should have been a bounce-back type matchup against the Colts, and he had just 12.4 fantasy points, 25 of 37, 285 passing yards, and a touchdown. -10 rushing yards as well in this game. We got Stephon Diggs banged up, may or may not play this week, No Nico Collins. It's Tank Dell, which is fine, but he's going to get the Sauce Gardner treatment. Then we're looking at John Mechie and Robert Woods and Xavier Hutchinson and Dalton Schultz at the tight end position. I mean, they're really going to lean on Joe Mixon in this game. So I think Stroud is still startable, but I would really only start Stroud if you have no better options. And I do think there's some okay streaming options at the quarterback position out there this week. So for the most part, I'm going to avoid CJ Stroud. But if you have nothing else, then he's still startable because he's still CJ Stroud. But man, this season has been more than disappointing if you are a CJ Stroud owner. That brings us to Dalton Schultz. Like I said, I mean, there should be more opportunity in this game for Dalton Schultz this week because of the potential of no Stephon Diggs, and we know that Collins is out, but this is still a bad matchup as the Jets are giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So I know he had his best game of the season so far in Week 8, but that still only brought you 9.2 fantasy points. So I'm going to sit Dalton Schultz. I think there's better options out there if you need to stream at the tight end position this week. Now, looking at the Jets, some of you might say it's unfair to say Stroud is in that category, but Rodgers is a streaming option, but the matchup is much better for Aaron Rodgers this week as the Texans have given up the 27th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. So I will also note that Rodgers is technically questionable going into the week, dealing with a hamstring and knee injury, but I think he'll be fine and he'll end up playing. And, you know, he had 17 fantasy points in Week 8. He has 17 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 starts, with 17 of 28 in Week 8, 233 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. I would imagine this is a game where the Jets are going to need to throw the football more. I mean, I don't know what we're going to get out of this Thursday night matchup. It is a tough matchup for the running backs going up against the Texans this week. So I think Rodgers is streamable, but I'll leave him at that. I'm not expecting anything crazy. And for the most part, I want to avoid Thursday night matchups in my starting lineup. And that brings us to Tyler Conklin, who does have 10 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games, 10 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games as well. So, I mean, 13.2 fantasy points against the Pats in Week 8, 4 targets, 3 catches, 42 receiver yards, and a touchdown. 2 touchdowns in his last 2 starts. He's definitely streamable, but prepare to be disappointed. But once again here, I mean, it's a bad matchup as the Texans are giving up the 4th fewest points to the tight end position. So he's streamable, but nothing more than that as we approach Week 9. Moving along to Sunday, let's take a look at the Saints, who are going to travel to face the Panthers. And I mean, this is just an awful matchup for quarterbacks and tight ends. I mean, maybe not an awful matchup, but just there's nothing here that we want to trust. So let's start with the Saints, okay? Derek Carr has been practicing so far on the week, still dealing with that oblique injury. So if Carr starts and plays in this game, he is certainly streamable. Alvin Kamara is still there and healthy. Chris Olave came back in week 8 and played well. So if Derek Carr is the guy this week, then yeah, we can stream Derek Carr, but I don't want to put him any higher than that. In his last 3 starts, he still had 13 or less fantasy points, but this is a great matchup against the Carolina Panthers, probably the worst defense in the NFL, giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the QB position. So Carr sits at just 16% rostered. He is certainly streamable. Spencer Rattler, Jake Haener, whoever comes in, if it's not Derek Carr, are not going to be starts for me this week. I think that's pretty easy to say, but it is a good matchup. So if you're thinking about getting cute in like a super flex league, don't do it. Jawan Johnson had a concussion going into week 8, but he has cleared concussion protocol and should be able to suit up in week 9, but he was okay this past week with 7.8 fantasy points, but I'm staying away from Jawan Jennings. And then we got Foster Moreau, 0 catches, 1 target this past week. I'm staying away from Foster Moreau. No interest really in the Saints offense this week from a quarterback tight end perspective, unless you were just desperate and need to roll out Derek Carr in this good matchup. Now, when we look at the Panthers, we got kind of a similar situation. Is Andy Dalton going to play? Is he not going to play? Don't have any reports that he has practiced yet this week, but I think there's a good chance he plays, but he is still dealing with that thumb injury. So whether it's Bryce Young or Andy Dalton this week, I don't have any interest in starting either player. I mean, the Saints defense certainly hasn't been as intimidating lately, and they're giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the quarterback position, but come on, what type of position are you in that you have to start Bryce Young or Andy Dalton? Just no thank you. Jatavion Sanders, 1.7 fantasy points this past week. Tommy Tremble, 3.3. Let's stay away from all Panthers tight ends moving into week 9. Moving along, we got the Washington Commanders traveling to face the New York Giants, and Jaden Daniels is a must start every week, even if he's dealing with a rib injury, even if he left the previous game early. We start Jaden Daniels no matter what. Now, to be fair, it wasn't his best performance against the Bears. I mean, it was a great performance. And he played injured. It was great, don't get me wrong. But you take away the Hail Mary, the total fantasy stat line comes down a bit here. But we're not going to take it away because it did happen. So he had 22.2 fantasy points, 21 of 38, 326 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 52 yards on the ground. Yes, start Jaden Daniels no matter what. Zach Ertz has been great as well. He's the tight end 10 in fantasy football currently, 10 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games. We've talked a lot about Zach Ertz lately on the channel over the past couple of weeks as a great streaming option, but I think he's just in that start category at this point. 11 targets, 7 catches, 77 receiving yards, was great in week 8. Keep rolling with Zach Ertz. And if he's out there and available, he sits at 40% rostered. He's a good option to pick up if you got Kittle or Freiermuth on bye week this week. Now, Danny Dimes, the Giants. Yeah, I think we will be sitting everybody involved here. 7.6 fantasy points on the road against the Steelers in week 8. 24-38, 264 passing yards, a pick, and a lost fumble. No thank you. Let's stay far away from Daniel Jones, who's the QB 30 in fantasy football. Then we got Theo Johnson, had one nice play in week 8, 6.5 fantasy points. We got Daniel Bellinger, 0 fantasy points, 0 targets. Stay away from any Giants players at both positions in this matchup and start both Jaden Daniels and Zach Ertz in this matchup going into week 9. Next up, we have the Dolphins, who are going to travel to face the Bills. And Tua Tagovailoa, a bit disappointing in his return from, the concussion protocol and all of that. But it was still okay. I mean, he was 28 of 38, 234 passing yards, 14.6 fantasy points, 13 yards rushing. And really, Devon Achane kind of dominated this game. Raheem Mostert, scored 2 touchdowns as well. So I'm not out on Tua by any stretch, but I'm not ready to put him in that start category. The Bills are still giving up the fourth fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position, so it is a steep matchup this week, but I think Tua is streamable. We'll leave him at that. He definitely deserves to be rostered, I think, but until we start to get into a little bit of a better stretch, starting in Week 10, where the Dolphins face the Rams, the Raiders, the Patriots in 3 straight weeks, I don't think we're going to be necessarily calling Tua a start. Johnny Smith, on the other hand, is definitely streamable, but with Tua starting, this is what I worried about. You're going to see more involvement out of Hill, Jalen Waddle to a degree, and the run game improve. And also, Johnny Smith, it seemed like he had a little bit of a better connection overall with Tyler Huntley. He came back to earth here with just 6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 20 receiving yards. He's still definitely streamable, but I'm not going to put him more than that, as the Bills are giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So definitely not my favorite streaming option, but if you're absolutely desperate, you could roll with him. Now, when we look at the Bills, this is pretty easy on a weekly basis. We start Josh Allen. No matter what, 20 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts, the QB4 in fantasy football. Nothing to break down here. He was 24-34, 283 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, and had 25 yards on the ground against Seattle. You roll Josh Allen no matter who you own. Dalton Kincaid, I've been saying basically the same thing. Like, I know some people have been a little bit down on Dalton Kincaid. He certainly hasn't had as much upside as we would have hoped going into the season, but 13.1 fantasy points in Week 8, 7 targets, 4 catches, 31 receiving yards, and a touchdown. You just continue to roll Dalton Kincaid if you own him. The Miami Dolphins have given up the 5th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position, so not a great matchup, but the tight end position seems like it's coming back to life here going into Week 9, so maybe you have another option that you like more, but for the most part, Dalton Kincaid is a solid start as we approach Week 9. Next up, we have the Chargers, who are going to travel to face the new and improved Cleveland Browns. So let's start with the Chargers side of things. Every week of the season so far, I've had Justin Herbert as a sit, but I think he's in the streaming category this week because this Cleveland Browns defense just not good, giving up the 28th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. And overall, in the past 2 weeks, we've seen a lot out of Justin Herbert that we've wanted to see on the season. No passing touchdowns in Week 7 against the Cardinals, and the red zone offense was awful for the Chargers, but he threw 349 passing yards, and then this past week had his best fantasy stat line of the whole week against the Saints. 24.6 fantasy points, was 20 of 32, 279 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and surprisingly added 49 rushing yards as well. So this is a good matchup. Herbert, I think, maybe you got Brock Purdy as your starting quarterback, or Anthony Richardson, Patrick Mahomes, who Mahomes was better this past week, but so you don't have the best option as your QB1 or somebody that you don't trust, you could certainly roll with Justin Herbert this week, who sits at 45% roster. The other underdog line that I love this week is Justin Herbert, sitting at 216.5 passing yards. He has hit that in the last 3 games, and I think this is going to be another matchup where the Browns, who are good against the run, poor against everything else, are going to force the Chargers potentially to throw the football more, and I think Herbert will smash this line, so I would head straight to underdog, take the over on Justin Herbert's passing yards, and then don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are going to get that free NFL Pick'em for the week. Take your free Pick'em, pair it with Herbert's over on the passing yards. Once that line hits, you're going to triple your cash entry, and on top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. My guy, Will Dissly, 9.1 fantasy points this past week, 7 targets, 16.1 fantasy points in Week 7, 11 targets. He's certainly in the streaming category. Hayden Hurst has been banged up. There's not really anybody else on this team at the tight end position to take a look at. So Will Dissly, I think, is streamable. He sits at 3% rostered. This Browns defense does not scare me, but they've been pretty good against tight ends, giving up the 8th fewest points. So if you're really desperate, but like I just mentioned a couple moments ago, like the tight end position's coming back to life. So I don't know that you're going to be that desperate, but he's at least in the streaming category for me going into the week. Now, I got Jameis Winston as a sit, which is probably going to trigger some people, but Listen, I think Winston should be rostered and picked up. I just kind of worry about this matchup against the Chargers this week for the most part here, as they're giving up the third fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. But also, I'm like, why do you need to start Jameis Winston this week? I could see it in a super flex league, a double quarterback league. That's a little bit different. But, if you're going to pick up Jameis Winston because of the stat line in week 8, that's fine. But why do you really need to start him this week? Is it that bad at the quarterback position? I just don't think it's going to be. So he's a good pickup. I like Jameis for the most part moving forward, but in a matchup like this, I just don't know that you need to do it. Plus, we got to be a little bit cautious. Like, the Ravens are giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position on the season. Their secondary is awful. They've been really bad against opposing quarterbacks and opposing tight ends. So David Njoku, Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, Elijah Moore, Jameis Winston, I'm not super surprised that they had a really good day at home against the Ravens. So, I mean, look at Andy Dalton, right? In his first start, absolutely balled out against the Raiders, then was okay against the Bengals, and then was bad outside of that since he's been the starter for the Panthers. So we just don't want to get too excited. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of upside here with Jameis Winston. He looked good this past week, threw 3 touchdowns. Don't forget, he essentially threw an interception that was dropped before he threw the game-winning touchdown. So there's still plenty of Jameis Winston involved here at the end of the day. I just don't think you need to start him, but maybe if you're desperate. I just don't think this matchup or anything is worth it this week. Now, David Njoku, on the other hand, has been great since he's been healthy and has been able to get rolling. I think he's basically in a must-start category this week. 17 or more fantasy points in the past 2 weeks. 7 targets, 5 catches, 61 receiving yards, a touchdown, 17.1 fantasy points in week 8. Not as good of a matchup this week, but I think David Njoku, definitely a very solid start going into week 9. Next up, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Tennessee Titans. And gosh, this might be the worst matchup that we go over all day. And we should have Drake May's name on the screen with an asterisk in case he does play. And if Drake May does play, I still don't like him this week. It's just not a good matchup. I know Drake May has been fine. Looked okay before he got the concussion in week 8 and had to leave the game. He was 3 of 6. He ran the ball 3 times for 46 rushing yards and a touchdown. So Drake May might be streamable if he plays this week, but I have a strong feeling he's not going to play this week and that we're going to get Jacoby Brissett as a starting quarterback. So if Brissett's the quarterback, there's no way we're starting him. And ultimately, I think this hurts Hunter Henry, who was okay last week with 9.5 fantasy points after having double-digit fantasy points 2 weeks in a row. But the Titans have given up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So I just don't love Hunter Henry this week. If you're desperate, he's still startable, but for a majority of you guys out there, I'm going to say go ahead and sit Hunter Henry and let's sit whatever Patriots quarterback we get this week. And basically, we got the same thing going on here with the Tennessee Titans. Now, Mason Rudolph was better this past week. Don't get me wrong. I mean, he had 21 fantasy points. So maybe there's a world where in a Superflex type league, we could consider Rudolph. The Patriots have given up the 18th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but yeah, I'm just not going to risk it. The game script was good for Mason Rudolph last week. He did some stuff, but he also threw 2 interceptions. So I'm going to stay away from Mason Rudolph. If you were, for some reason, considering him this week, then as far as any tight end for the Tennessee Titans, just no thank you. Chicken Conco had 1.4 fantasy points in week 8. Josh Weil had 5.3. There's just nothing here. Let's avoid this matchup for both of these positions moving into week 9. Next up, we got a nice matchup between the Cowboys and the Falcons. And Dak Prescott, was not good this past week. He had 15 fantasy points, and it felt like he was basically doing a majority of that work in garbage time. He was 25 of 38, 243 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks, -1 rushing yards. I get it. If you own Dak Prescott, you're not feeling very good right now, but the Falcons have given up the 19th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. They're allowing for good game scripts. They're allowing for a lot of offense. So I'm going to say if you own Dak Prescott and you don't have a better option, he is still startable this week. He might not be my favorite overall start, but I definitely am not ready to just flat out say bench Dak Prescott. Now, definitely depends on who else is on your roster, but I will say that I think Prescott as well as Jake Ferguson are both solid starts this week. The Falcons giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the tight end position. Ferguson, 8 targets, 6 catches, 23 receiving yards this past week, 8.3 fantasy points. I think Jake Ferguson is a solid start this week. Once again, not my favorite, maybe not the most upside out of Prescott or Ferguson this week, but due to the matchup and the potential game script here, I think they are both still startable players. That brings us to Kirk O'Chains, who I think once again is a good start this week. I was actually a little bit worried about Kirk this past week, but he came out just fine against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 28.6 fantasy points, 23 of 29, 276 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns. When he plays the Buccaneers, he throws for 4 touchdowns. What do we get when he plays the Cowboys? Well, I'm not quite sure, but I'll tell you that this Cowboys defense just does not scare me. They have given up the 12th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I think Kirk Cousins is a solid start this week, but we do want to be careful with Kirk. I know he's coming off a great game, but outside of the 2 games that he's played, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he has 17 or less fantasy points in every single game. And you take away that week 2 matchup against Philly, he has 12.5 or less fantasy points in every game, except for the Tampa Bay matchups and the Philly matchups. So be careful with Kirk Cousins. It depends on who else you have, but he's certainly startable. I just don't know what the upside is. But like I said, I'm expecting some offense here and a good game script, so he's okay this week. Now, Kyle Pitts basically in the must-start category moving forward. I mean, he has been fantastic the past 4 weeks. The Cowboys giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. There's really no reason to consider benching Kyle Pitts. 10 or more fantasy points in his last 4 starts, a season high of 25.1 in Week 8, 5 targets, 4 catches, 91 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Kyle Pitts, a great start as we approach Week 9. Moving along, we got the Raiders who are going to travel to face the Bengals. And what are we going to get out of Gardner Minshew and Desmond Ridder and the Raiders this week? I don't know. But, I mean, they were a bit better this past week. Minshew was 24 of 30, 209 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns against the Chiefs. Stayed in that game for the most part. Gardner Minshew did have the fumble at the end of the game, but there's still not enough from a fantasy perspective here to start Gardner Minshew. So he remains a sit. And if for any reason we were to see Desmond Ridder come into this game or get named the starter, which I don't quite think is going to happen, then we're staying away from Desmond Ridder as well for sure. But we're not staying away from Brock Bowers, who still had 10 fantasy points this past week, 5 targets, 5 catches, 58 receiving yards. He continues to be a must-start tight end, no matter what, coming in as the tight end 3 so far on the season. Then when we look at the Bengals, we continue to roll with Joe Burrow, QB6 so far on the season. I know the past 2 weeks have not been kind to Joe Burrow, and the Raiders, don't underestimate them, have given up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and they've been pretty good against opposing wide receivers as well, but I'm not ready to bench Joe Burrow. Maybe you have another quarterback on your roster who you feel better about, but ultimately Joe Burrow, a strong start this week. And I know Mike Gesicki show back up in Week 8 against Philly, 8 targets, 7 catches, 73 receiving yards with no T. Higgins out there, and really no wide receiver behind Jamar Chase stepping up. But, I mean, maybe if Higgins doesn't play this week again, he could roll with Mike Gesicki. But I'm just not going to trust this one random stat line in a decent matchup against the Raiders, giving up the 19th most fantasy points to the position. You know, between weeks 3 and 7, Mike Gesicki had 8.7 or less fantasy points in every matchup, and in 4 of those matchups, 5 or less fantasy points. So let's stay away, in my opinion. Eric All had 5.2 fantasy points in Week 8. He gets some usage, 2 targets, 2 catches, 32 receiving yards, but not enough usage for us to throw him into our starting lineup. So really in this matchup, I'm just looking at the 2 studs, Brock Bowers, Joe Burrow, and staying away from everybody else. Next up, we got a fun one. We got the Broncos traveling to face the Ravens. Bo Nix, my favorite streaming option at the quarterback position last week. If you go back and watch the last minute waiver video, we talked about this, and he is your quarterback 9 so far on the season. Since week 3, 19 or more fantasy points in every game except for weeks 4 and 7. In his last 4 starts, 21 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 starts. So you might look at this matchup and say, I don't know about the Ravens. The Ravens are giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. Jameis Winston just sliced and diced them. Bo Nix is a very solid streaming option this week, sitting at 35% rostered, and dare I say he's a good start this week as well. But we'll proceed still with a little bit of caution in Bo Nix's rookie season here, but I think he's a very solid streaming option this week if you need some help at the position. And like I talked about in the last minute waiver video last week, there's going to be times this week this season, where we can easily spot play Bo Nix. He gets the Raiders in week 12, the Falcons in week 11, the Browns in week 13, the Colts in week 15, Bengals in week 17. He's going to be a player at times that we can count on for 18, 20 fantasy points. So he should probably be rostered in a bit higher percentage of leagues, sitting at 35% rostered. And you guys might think I'm crazy for this one, but I'm heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Bo Nix's passing yards, sitting at just 210.5 total passing yards. We took one of the overs on Bo Nix last week on Underdog, and we're doing it again this week in a smash matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. Don't forget, guys, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are getting a free NFL Pick'em for the week. Take Bo Nix's over on the passing yards. He has hit this line in 2 out of the last 3 matchups. Take your free Pick'em. Once Bo Nix's line hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry, and while you're doing so, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Now, we saw some involvement out of the tight end position this past week for the Denver Broncos as they were massacring the Carolina Panthers. We saw a touchdown to Adam Trotman, and we saw a touchdown to Nate Adkins, who's, I guess his name should be on the screen. And then Lucas Krull continued to get some involvement with 2 catches. But yeah, we're staying away from all these names as none of these guys who showed up this past week have done anything so far on the season. So let's avoid any tight end on the Denver Broncos. Now, on the other hand, we got the best offense arguably in the league, even if their defense is awful, or maybe outside of the run game, they're awful. But Lamar Jackson, I mean, come on, this year quarterback 1 so far in the season. We are starting Lamar Jackson. I've already gotten some questions this week, like, do I set Lamar Jackson against the Broncos? No, you don't. You start Lamar Jackson. No matter what, it's a nice home game here for the Ravens. They're coming off a loss. They're going to be coming out here and humming. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is a tough matchup overall, but they're going to be just fine. You start Lamar Jackson no matter what. Don't overthink it. Mark Andrews has been great in the past 4 weeks with 9.5 or more fantasy points. The Broncos giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to the position, but in my opinion right now, Mark Andrews, who's the tight end 7 so far on the year, if you own him, keep rolling with the punches. He should be a good start this week. Isaiah Likely did have 8.7 fantasy points this past week, 4 targets, 4 catches, 47 receiving yards, but we're just going to stay away from Isaiah Likely. I mean, Isaiah Likely, to his credit, is the tight end 9 on the season, which is just crazy, but that's because of weeks 1 and week 5, and then added a little boost, I guess, this past week. But yeah, not enough consistency here for me to recommend starting Isaiah Likely as we approach week 9. Next up, we got the Bears, who are going to travel to face the Cardinals. Caleb Williams, not a good fantasy stat line this past week. I was expecting a little bit more out of Caleb Williams, but I guess it's time to not underestimate that Commanders defense. But on top of that, the offensive line play in terms of pass protection was awful on the road against Washington this past week. So what do we do this week on the road again against the Arizona Cardinals? I'll put Caleb Williams in the start category as the Cardinals are giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to the quarterback position, although they've looked a little better the past 2 weeks, don't get me wrong. So I don't know if Caleb Williams is my favorite start this week, but I think he's still very startable. We do need to kind of look at the fact that Caleb Williams, the games where he's had 20 or more fantasy points this year, they were against arguably the 2 worst defenses in the NFL, and the Panthers and the Jaguars. Then he had a down game against the Rams, another defense that's really struggled in week 4. And then in week 3 against the Colts, another very bad defense, he had 19 fantasy points. So a little bit of a head scratcher here with what to do with Caleb Williams because, didn't play well against the Titans, didn't play well against the Texans, the Rams, now the Commanders, but has played well against 3 really soft defenses. So I don't know if he's a must start every single week, but he's definitely startable this week because the Cardinals overall have still struggled against the quarterback position as well as most other positions. So he's startable this week, but it depends on who else you have and who you're going to end up starting him over. Cole Kmet, one of the only tight ends this past week who did next to nothing. 4.4 fantasy points, 1 target, 1 catch, 14 receiving yards, and a positive game script. Little worrisome, but he's been fine for the most part all season long, so you can continue to roll with the punches if you own Cole Kmet. The Cardinals giving up the 18th most fantasy points to the tight end position. He's a solid start this week, but it definitely depends on who else you have at the position. Taking us to the Cardinals, Kyler Murray. Don't doubt him. He's moved up to the quarterback 8 so far on the season. He has 21 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts, 22 fantasy points against the Miami Dolphins in Week 8, who were giving up the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks going into the week. He was 26 of 36, 307 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 19 yards on the ground. So Kyler continues to be a solid start. This is a tough matchup as the Bears are giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the position. But yeah, you own Kyler Murray. Take the upside, roll with the punches. I would continue to start Kyler Murray as we go into the week. It's worth noting, like I said, tough matchup this week, tough matchup next week against the Jets before the bye week. But I think if you own Kyler, just keep rolling with them. And another guy you roll with every single week is Trey McBride, who had his best fantasy day of the season so far this past week against Miami. 21.4 fantasy points, 11 targets, 9 catches, 124 receiving yards. If you own Trey McBride, yes, start him every single week. He's the tight end 5 so far on the season. Next up, we have the Jaguars. You're going to travel to face the Eagles. And Trevor Lawrence. I mean, what do we do here? He's a QB 12 so far in fantasy football, and I think he's actually quite streamable this week. The Eagles have still given up the 25th most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. This defense has looked better in the past couple weeks. They're playing very good against the run, and I will say I worry about Trevor Lawrence this week. He might need to be closer to a sit, but we got a couple things up in the air here that I think could still end up making Trevor Lawrence streamable this week. Brian Thomas Jr. is day-to-day with that chest injury. So if B-Tom plays, that helps Trevor Lawrence be a potential streaming option this week. If he doesn't play, I don't think I'm going to risk Trevor Lawrence this week as Christian Kirk is out for the season with a broken collarbone. Gabe Davis does have a shoulder injury he's working through, but he's expected to play through it this week is the latest report. Still got Evan Ingram. We might get Travis Etienne back this week who can catch some balls. You got Tate Bigsby there. So, Parker Washington looked okay, getting a little bit of involvement this past week with all the injuries. So, listen, Trevor Lawrence, 21 of 32 in Week 8, 308 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and a rushing touchdown. He's had 18 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. He's definitely startable, or maybe I should say streamable, but if Brian Thomas Jr. can't play this week, I don't know that I'm very confident in Trevor Lawrence going into this matchup. But like I said, the Eagles have been good against the run, so I do think that the Jags are going to be forced to throw the football, and their defense is awful. The Eagles are going to score some points here at home, so there should be a game script that benefits Trevor Lawrence, but how much help is he going to have out there? I don't know. But he will have Evan Ingram, who had 5 targets, 4 catches, 36 receiving yards, and his first touchdown on the season in Week 8, 13.6 total fantasy points. You own Evan Ingram. Yes, start Evan Ingram on a weekly basis. It's been great to see him back in action. He's a strong start this week. On the other hand, we got the Eagles players here. Jalen Hurts is always a strong start on every single given week, and he proved that this past week with his best fantasy performance of the entire season, 35 fantasy points, 16 of 20, 236 passing yards, a passing touchdown. Not a ton through the air, but he had 37 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. That's the Jalen Hurts we're used to. 5 rushing touchdowns through 2 weeks. Let's go. This is a great matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, one of the worst defenses in the NFL. You own Jalen Hurts. You're starting him no matter what. Dallas Goedert missed this past week with a hamstring injury. If he plays, Dallas Goedert's a good start. You roll with the punches. His last 2 starts, he's at 13 or more fantasy points, but he's been hurt for 3 weeks now. So that brings us to Grant Calcaterra, who had 8.8 fantasy points this past week, 3 targets, 3 catches, 58 receiving yards. I mean, this offense is going to funnel through the upside of Jalen Hurts, the rushing ability of Saquon Barkley, and then their 2 stud wide receivers. But as we've talked about the past couple weeks, this Jaguars defense can't defend tight ends. They can't defend anything, don't get me wrong, but they are so bad against the tight end position, it's almost puzzling. So if you're really desperate and Dallas Goedert does not play this week, I think that Grant Calcaterra could be a streaming option at the tight end position due to the matchup as we approach week 9. Next up, we've got the Rams, who are going to travel to face the Seattle Seahawks. And let's start with Matthew's staph infection. He's back, baby. This Rams offense is back. I don't think their defense is quite back, but Puka's back. Kupp is back. The life is here for the Rams offense. Demarcus Robinson looked great this past week. Kyron Williams has never been gone. He's still a thing, right? So 4 passing touchdowns in Week 8 against the Vikings on Thursday Night Football for Stafford. 25 of 34, 279 passing yards, 25.7 fantasy points. And this Seattle Seahawks defense looks awful. They're still giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to the position so far on the year, but Stafford should be a strong start this week, a good streaming option. Depends on who you have. Like, don't go benching a stud for Stafford this week, but he's certainly a strong option, sitting at 33% rostered as we approach the week. Colby Parkinson, not so much, 3.7 fantasy points, 2 targets, 2 catches. With Puka out there, Kupp out there, there's really no upside for Colby Parkinson. He's a sit this week. Now, we look at Geno Smith and company. Geno is still a top 10 quarterback so far in the season, but I think I'm done kind of trusting his ranking overall. The Rams are giving up the 17th most fantasy points to the quarterback position, so it's not an awful matchup. He's probably still streamable, but in 2 of his last 3 matchups, he's had 14 or less fantasy points, and he's had 17 or less fantasy points in his last 3 starts. Threw an interception last week, had a fumble, threw no touchdowns. The Bills dominated the Seahawks. I just don't want to start Geno Smith this week. I don't think that you're really going to be forced to, but let's say you're in a super flex double quarterback league. You got nothing else there this week. He's probably okay, but let's avoid him if we can. 5.2 fantasy points to Noah Fant this past week. He came back to earth after having double digits 2 weeks in a row. I just have no interest in starting Noah Fant. He's going to be a streaming option that at any given point can get you 5 points or 10 points or 3 points. You'll get some points out of Noah Fant, but good luck guessing when he's going to actually get you enough to get you through the week. So let's sit Noah Fant as we approach week 9. Moving along, we have the Lions traveling to face the Packers in what will hopefully be a good overall divisional matchup. Jared Goff going up against the Packers here. Not the best matchup, as they are giving up the 14th fewest fantasy points to the opposing quarterback position, but I mean, what are we going to do with Goff? He threw 3 touchdowns this past week, only had 15.5 fantasy points. Threw 2 touchdowns a week before, had 18.8 fantasy points. But he had 25 or more fantasy points in the previous 2 weeks. And really, the fact that Goff could throw 3 touchdowns and only have 15.5 fantasy points is really a testament to how good this offense has been overall. So I think if you own Goff, you just keep rolling with him. It depends on who else you have, but this offense doing so many different things right now, doing so many things well right now, that I want pieces of this offense. This is a big divisional matchup here against the Packers. Hoping for a good game, scripted good points in this game. Overall, I think Goff is a strong start this week, and I think with the absence of Jamison Williams, Sam Laporta is also a strong start. And for majority of the season, I've told you guys you own Laporta. Just keep rolling with the punches unless you've found another solution at tight end. 16.8 fantasy points this past week, his best overall game. 6 targets, 6 catches, 48 receiving yards, and a touchdown. You own Laporta. You can roll with him again this week in an important divisional matchup. I think he's a strong start. The Packers giving up the 21st most fantasy points to the tight end position, so Laporta a strong start this week. Now, what do we do here? Jordan Love dealing with a strained groin. He's considered day-to-day. I think there's going to be a strong push for Jordan Love to play in this game, just like there's a strong push for him to play in that Week 4 matchup against Minnesota. These are important divisional games. This division is very, very competitive. So I think there's going to be a push for Love to play this week, but we'll find out if he can play or not. It's also worth noting that the Packers have a bye week in Week 10, so it's a good opportunity for him to get some rest, which he might need now dealing with his second injury on the season. So we'll see what happens, but if Jordan Love plays, I mean, this is way too good of a potential game script. The Lions still giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position, so if Love plays, it's risky due to the injury, but he's probably still a strong start. Tucker Kraft, on the other hand, continues to be a strong start. And since Week 4, Tucker Kraft has 5 touchdowns. 5 touchdowns in the last 5 weeks. Double digits in every game except for Week 6 against Arizona. 16.8 fantasy points this past week. 3 targets, 3 catches, 78 receiving yards, and a tutty. Keep rolling with Tucker Kraft if you own him. He's a tight end 2 on the season. Now, Malik Willis, if he gets the start, I'm not going to start him. It's not a bad matchup. I'm not taking anything away from Malik Willis, who has been a fine starter and replacement of Jordan Love this season. He threw a touchdown this past week. He threw a touchdown and ran for a touchdown in Week 3 against the Titans, had 25 fantasy points. 12 fantasy points in Week 2 and threw a touchdown. But I just don't want to risk it. I don't think you're really going to be in a position where you have to start Malik Willis. If he gets the start and you're absolutely desperate in like a super flex league, the matchup's good, but for a majority of you guys watching this, I don't think there's any reason to start Malik Willis. So hopefully we get a good game script here, a nice divisional matchup, points and all of that. Hopefully Jordan Love can play and stay healthy. We'll see what happens as we get into Week 9. Next up, we got another tricky one as we have the Colts, who are going to travel to face the Minnesota Vikings. And the Colts so far to go into the week have not committed to a starting quarterback as Anthony Richardson continues to struggle. His QB rating's awful. He's taking himself out of the game. He's too tired to play. Looks like a little bit of a potential disaster here at the position for the Colts, and this team has just been better when Joe Flacco's the starting quarterback, but it's also hard to walk away from such an early first-round draft pick, but we'll see what happens. So if Richardson starts, I'm sitting Richardson in a matchup against the Vikings. No, thank you. I mean, the Vikings have struggled against the quarterback position. They have struggled against wide receivers, but their front seven's quite good. So just no thank you here. Now, if Flacco gets the start, he's streamable. I mean, we know what we could get out of Flacco. He only had 14 fantasy points in Week 6, right? He had 26 fantasy points against the Jags, but they're one of the worst defenses in the NFL. 15 fantasy points in relief in Week 4. So Flacco's streamable. You could start him if you want to, but once again, what position are you in that you have to pick up Joe Flacco and stream him? And while the matchup here this week is pretty good overall, to say the least, I mean, the Vikings are giving up the 31st most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I don't know that you really have to run to the waiver wire, pick up Joe Flacco and throw him in. But if you are desperate, sure, Flacco is streamable this week. Any Colts tight end, Will Mallory, Kyron Grayson, Mo Alley Cox, nobody here is worth starting. We don't need to break them down. Now, on the other hand, for the Vikings, I think Sam Darnold is a solid start this week, and I think that's really what we've got Sam Darnold as for the rest of the season. The Colts giving up the 15th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, but Darnold's a solid start. 17 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts since Week 2. 17 or more fantasy points in every game outside of Week 5 against the Jets. 240 passing yards against the Rams, 2 touchdowns. Darnold is fine to start. Now, Hawkinson might get his first start this week as he's been activated to the 53-man roster. Did not play this past week against the Rams, but if Hawkinson plays, I think he's startable. He's not my favorite start. I will say that much. I don't want to roll him out there in his first overall start on the season, but he is certainly an okay start if you have no better options. But once again, what position are you in that Hawkinson's your best option? You haven't had to start him all season long. There should be somebody in front of him on your roster. So startable, but not my favorite start. Let's try to give it another week or two. He does play the Jaguars in Week 10, for example. I would prefer that matchup in his second potential game on the season outside of this matchup. So Johnny Munt is the other tight end involved here. Just 2 fantasy points in Week 8 for my guy Johnny Munt. he's a sit moving into week 9. Last but not least, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers traveling to face the Kansas City Chiefs. So what do we do here? Baker Mayfield's the QB2 on the season. He gets a tough matchup this week as the Chiefs are giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. And I got a little concerned about Baker going into last week, without Godwin, without Mike Evans, and what are we going to get out of these wide receivers? And then Sterling Shepard gets hurt, of course, but Baker, 24.3 fantasy points, 37 of 50, 330 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He has thrown a total of 7 picks in the last 3 weeks, and he has 24 or more fantasy points in each game with a ceiling of 29 fantasy points. So the ceiling could be lower this week in this matchup on the road, but Rachaad White's going to catch some passes. Bucky Irving's going to catch some passes, and Cade Otton's going to catch a lot of passes. So I think that Baker is certainly still startable. It's hard to bench him as he's been a top 5 fantasy quarterback all season long, but understand that the ceiling could seriously be lowered this week. This Chiefs defense is nothing to play around with. They're good against the run, they're good against the pass, and they're good against opposing quarterbacks. So just proceed with caution this week when it comes to Baker. He's a little bit of a risky start, but it's hard to bench him. He has just produced week in and week out every week this season except for that week 3 matchup against the Broncos. Now, the Chiefs do struggle against the tight end position. They're giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position so far on the season. Cade Otton, 29.1 fantasy points in week 8, 10 targets, 9 catches, 81 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. You own Cade Otton. You are firing him up with confidence this week. He's going to see another massive amount of volume in this game. He's a very strong start going into week 9. Now that brings us to the Kansas City Chiefs. And Patrick Mahomes had his best fantasy day of the season in week 8. I was close last week to calling him a sit, but I told you guys this matchup against the Raiders, we can't ignore this. He's still a start this week. Let's give him one more week. 19 fantasy points feels like a miracle for Patrick Mahomes this year, which is crazy to say. 27 of 38, 262 passing yards, 2 tutties. He threw a pick. He's had a pick every game this year, 17 rushing yards. This is a good matchup, though, against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, giving up the 26 most fantasy points to the position on the season. Roll with Patrick Mahomes and have some confidence. I think he's a strong start this week. Travis Kelce, some of you guys were ready to trade him, drop him again after week 7. I told you guys, come on, double digits 2 games in a row. You're ready to drop him after 5.7 fantasy points. We're getting a lot of volatility out of tight ends this year. Kelce's still a top 15 tight end on the season. Came through 25 fantasy points in week 8. We had him as a start as well last week. 12 targets, 10 catches, 90 receiving yards, and his first touchdown on the season. You own Kelce. Just keep rolling with him. He should be a strong start against the Bucs and a positive game script this week. Noah Gray, who has seen a little bit more involvement with the injuries piling up here for the Chiefs, but 3 targets, 3 catches, 23 receiving yards, 5.3 fantasy points this past week. Not enough to start Noah Gray unless you're in an extremely desperate situation and just need a couple points. But for the most part, we got 4 solid starts here as we approach week 9. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single quarterback, every single tight end, and who you should be starting or sitting as we approach week 9 of the season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 9 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, guys, as the week progresses, we're going to have everything you could possibly need here on the channel to help you guys dominate week 9 of 2024 fantasy football. So make sure you guys are checking out all of the videos, but more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.